in the help menu. This is in the sample data set, the sample index, and it's just called bands. And it has one Y, this banding, and we want to predict whether or not this process that has 32 predictors is going to lead to banding. And so we're going to use the predictor selection assistant to help us do that. First of all, let's just go look and do analyze. And if we had standard jump, then we might go and run predictor screening, and we'd take banding, and we'd put all our predictors in there. We click OK, and pretty quickly we'll get that Pareto chart of importance, and we can certainly see that some of these are really important and some are not. If we have Jump Pro, then we're probably going to skip over predictor screening, and we're just going to run Bootstrap Forest. And to do that, we're going to load in our response, all of our factors. If we wanted, we could load in a validation column, but for now, we'll just go with what we have. And then we're just going to go with the default set of parameters here and click OK. We don't see that Pareto chart like we do in predictor screening initially, but what we can do is we can just go up to the red triangle and we can say column contributions, and now we get a chart that looks very similar to predictor screening. And so these would be the tools that you could use, and it would be a good start to understanding what predictors are most important. But what if we wanted to build a model? Where would we stop? How confident am I that this is actually predicting variance in my response? So what we do in the predictor selection assistant is we can go back to our data table, we load the add-in predictor selection, and it's going to load very similar to other jump platforms. So we're going to put in our Y, we're going to put in our X. So you can choose what decision tree method is available. If you don't have Jump Pro, you don't get the selection for Bootstrap Forest. We'll select that. If you want, you can add additional random uniform columns. So maybe we'll add 2 of those for fun. And if you want to run validation, you can do that as well. Now we're going to click OK. And now we're going to specify actually, I just see that I've got a prediction selection open. Oh no, we're good. Just want to make sure I'm not running it twice. So now we get some analysis information, and what we need to determine is the number of iterations. So the iterations is how many times we're going to run that Bootstrap Forest model. So even though Bootstrap Forest is running multiple decision trees, like 100 or 200 decision trees, we're going to run that 10 times and aggregate those results. That way we can start to understand the variation in our shadow columns. We can go down here and specify the Bootstrap Forest parameters just like you could in Bootstrap Forest if you wanted to do that. We're going to leave those with default. In the add-in, we make some recommendations. So I don't know if you knew this, but when you run Bootstrap Forest, Jump actually looks at the number of predictors that you're putting in there and makes some recommendations on some of these parameters. So we do the same thing in the predictor selection assistant. So you can just go with the default if you want, but you can of course change them. And when we're all set, we just click go. So we're going to get a little progress bar that's going to show us it's running those Bootstrap Forest models. Takes a little bit of time. And then what we're also going to do is run a t-test between every predictor column and its shadow column, because that's going to give us some additional information on whether or not that predictor column is statistically different than its shadow. So we created an interface that's very similar to the Pareto charts that you've seen in predictor screening and Bootstrap Forest. And we tried to keep a lot of the interactivity the same, so you can select columns in your in the output here, and they'll highlight in the data table. That will help facilitate modeling. But what we see, instead of just getting this Pareto chart, we also have what we a strength classification. So here is that max shadow column. So we said that that's going to be our control for the Dunnett's test. And so here's that max shadow column. And so anything that is not statistically different than that max shadow column is being labeled as a medium strength. And then anything that's statistically different and has a higher portion contribution, and this is the mean portion across all those 10 Bootstrap Forest models, is going to be considered strong, and then anything lower is going to be considered weak. You can also see in here we've got those random uniform columns. And so it's always nice to see that that random noise that we put in there is either classified as medium or weak and not coming in as strong. So this is the main overview. If you really want to see all of the aggregated Bootstrap Forest results, they're all here, as well as the individual models. So you could look in just like you would if you would run these individually. So we log all that data so it's traceable if you want to dig into it further. The Dunnett's analysis is showing, this is a one-way analysis with Dunnett's control. And what we're doing is now just visualizing how we classified the strength of those predictors. So in this case, you can certainly see that these portion values are much higher than our control value here. So here's that max shadow column. And if we wanted to zoom in, we can use this global filter over here. So, maybe we'll turn off the weak and the medium. And so we can just focus in on the strong. So we can see that these are all statistically different than the max shadow with Dunnett's in the Dunnett's control test. And so that's why they're classified as strong. If we look at the medium, these are all within, and this is the quantile. So the quantile range of the max shadow, I can't remember what we used to create this region. I think it's the 90th to 10th quantile range. And then if you want to look at the weak, you can also see that those are substantially lower in strength. So that's just helps you visualize the portion values with respect to the shadow columns. You can also look here at the predictor shadow difference. So this is showing the t-test results now. So this is the ink percent versus the ink percent shadow. And this is just a two-sided t-test. So the p-value is indicating that that difference is significant. So that gives us more confidence that ink percent is not only strong, but it's also significantly different than its shadow. So we would consider that a good predictor or a strong predictor. You can see as we get down to these mediums, some of these medium values, are also going to be significantly different than their shadow column, even though they don't predict as much portion value with respect to that max shadow column, the pooled max shadow column. If we want to look at that t-test, you can go to the red triangle and we can show the individual results. So I can look at that hardener and now it's pretty clear. And I can look at the other t-tests just to see how they're different they are. And as we get down here towards the bottom, we can see that chrome content is weak and chrome content is not even, statistically different with respect to that chrome shadow column. So you can use this as just another double check to see if the predictors that you're selecting are different than their shadow column. And then finally, we get a little progress bar. So this will accumulate as we do some down selection. So anything classified as strong, will show up here, medium, week, and then we can also see the shadow columns. So the way that you can use this now is you might say, okay, well, let's rerun this, and I'm just going to eliminate, I'm pretty confident that these week, based on my Dunnett's analysis or my t-tests, I might come in here and say that, even though cylinder size is weak, it's different than its shadow column. So maybe I keep that one in because it just might have a very small effect size. So if I'm interested in building a machine learning model and I don't really have a limitation on the number of factors I'm putting in there, this is, even though it's weak, it's statistically different than its shadow column. So maybe I want to keep that in the next round of tests just to see. So what I can do is I can select any of these. Oops, we'll turn this off. I can select any of these shadow columns here, or actually I want to select the ones this way. And I want to cast those into this predictor list. And I can see that I've added 23 predictors, and I'm leaving some of these out. And what we could do is we could create a column group in our main data table, and that would just group all those columns so that we have a handle on what we want to do next. Or what I want to do here is just rerun this analysis. So I'm going to click rerun. And now it's just going to go through that whole process with all the specifications that we had before. It's going to run the bootstrap forest models, but only with those predictors that we had cast into that column. And now it's going to hopefully weed out and resolve some of those medium ones or the weak ones. And so we're going to go see that progress bar. So now we see here, we've got iteration number 2, which had bootstrap forest models 11 through 20. And sometimes you can see, yeah, like in this one, you can see this one was considered strong, but once we weeded out some and narrowed it down, it's really maybe medium. Maybe it's not as strong as we thought it was. So we'll either want to keep an eye on that one or run it again. We can see some of these weak, so that these were dropped. It doesn't look like any of our weak ones went from weak to medium or weak to strong, but we can certainly take a look at, again, at our t-tests or our Dunnett's analysis. And now these, the overview and Dunnett's analysis and predictor shadow differences are all now based on that subset of columns that we ran. And you could go ahead and do this again. Maybe you go and say, well, we don't need these weak columns. Let's resolve these further. We can cast those and then rerun the analysis. The goal here is to do some iteration and use the statistical tests that we've provided or your own tests on that subset to narrow down the pool of candidates. And then now eventually we might get to a pool of factors that are all strong or medium, but we've certainly gotten rid of all of our weak ones. So that would be the workflow. And if we wanted to, now we could say, let's take all of these and we'll create that column group. And then we would call this important factors. Click OK. And so now we've got just a nice little column group of those important factors that we could then put into some sort of modeling platform or wherever you might want to take that next. So I think that's all I really wanted to show. Hopefully give it a try. I think it's certainly helpful at visualizing relative strength of predictors, and the tests that we used are just giving more confidence in how you select those predictors so that you can stand behind them with some statistical tests. So I'll double check the chat, but if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer questions, or certainly would like to hear what you might, some thoughts on the add-in. Let's see.
Scott, there's a couple questions in the chat. If no one has questions that they want to ask, coming off mute.
So will you be explaining how the final predictors are confirmed? So I don't know, Paul, did I get to your question about how the final predictors are being confirmed?
And Paul, feel free to come off mute.
Okay. Well, let's just
Yeah.
okay.
Excuse me. I just wasn't, quite sure what you meant by confirm the
Okay.
final predictors.
Yeah, it's mostly about that workflow. So confirming and that you're convincing yourself as the subject matter expert that you've got the appropriate confidence in these predictors to then move forward and either create a design with these strong ones or create a model or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if maybe there was some internal cross-fold validation where it was showing
Mm,
that the R squared on the out of fold was as good as the R squared on the in fold or whatever.
yeah, that's a good idea. I think if you really wanted to, you could certainly go through and aggregate all of that data and look at your, um, yeah, where is the out of bag? Yeah, so you could go through the Bootstrap for, or you could add that validation column and then have some more confidence in those models as well. See, Diego, instead of running Bootstrap Force, any plans to with XGBoost with Kform? XGBoost as the selection method. That's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought of that, Diego, but that would be, yeah, I think that could be something we could consider.
Yeah, I mean, Ross Wolfinger, he already has presented in this forum, and I noticed you actually had the XGBoost installed when you were going through the add-ins.
Hmm.
And, the benefit, I mean, it's very powerful. There is a lot of customization you can make in the settings. It allows a K-fold cross-validation with DOE that works pretty well. That could be an extra validation. And what I really love, if you go to those advanced options, that in the platform,
Hmm.
there is an option for monotone constraints.
Yeah.
That is super helpful because sometimes, when you do like a bootstrap forest, you may end up with some wiggly profilers.
Hmm.
And from a subject matter expertise, it has to be monotonically positive or monotonically negative. So I found imposing those monotone constraints, there are some interesting behaviors where maybe variables that were influential drop and maybe some what were not influential are improving because you're kind of adding that subject matter expertise of how the relationship should look
Hmm.
like. So you guys already done all the hard work with this adding. If you could
Yeah.
tie it together with this platform, I feel it will be super powerful.
Yeah, I was just seeing, I don't think they generate, um, so we use portion as our summary statistic.
They
So
have
I'm
SHAP values, and the SHAP values, I use them as a proxy for like variable importance.
okay. Yeah, so maybe, yeah, I guess the other way to do it would be you would have to launch the profiler
Yeah.
and then get your variable importance
Hmm.
this way, and then you get that Pareto chart. So yeah, that's a good thought. I'll definitely think about that.
Yeah, I mean, based on experience, it's like the most powerful modeling jump right now.
Yeah. Mathematical explanation behind max shadow. So the max shadow, if we look at one of these bootstrap forest models, so we run model number one, and this is the full results. So you can see that we've got our factors as well as all of our shadows down here. So the shadows are typically going to have much lower portion values. Um, and so what we do is we say, okay, in um, Bootstrap Forest 1, we look for the maximum portion from a shadow column. So this would be that portion value, and this gets pulled aside. And then in Bootstrap Forest number 2, we do the same thing, and we find the highest shadow. Oops, maybe I misspoke before, but I don't remember if that was a shadow column. But here's the highest shadow column in terms of portion value. So then that would be the maximum shadow value for Bootstrap forest model 2, and we do that for all of them, and then we pool them all together. And so when you look at this, that's why we have a range on that max shadow, because it's going to be the maximum shadow portion value for each of those 10 bootstrap forest models. P-values be adjusted using the false discovery rate, Arvid? I don't know. I haven't thought about that, but what,
You're
where do you?
doing a bunch of t-tests, so should you adjust that since to keep the,
I see. So instead of looking at just the individual effect,
yes.
that is a good question.
I think
I'm
that
writing
might
that down.
even help it align better. The two methods align better if you did that.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, because then you're taking into consideration all of the other variables. Yeah, let me think about that and how. Yeah, because I think what we do is we just run one way, but we would need to run response screening in order to get the FDR p-values. Is that right, or is there a way to get that
There's an
in?
add-in.
So we'll have add-ins running add-ins. So
Yeah, there's an add-in. You
yeah.
might be able to do it another way, but there is an add-in.
Okay, interesting. I'll have to look into that for sure.
Something John wrote, I think.
Okay, gotcha. Great. What is the meaning of additional uniform? So those uniform were, if just for instance, like if you weren't using predictor screening assistant, you might go to screening and predictor screening, and we put in our variables. And then in order to determine where some cutoff might be, it looks like I grabbed one here. So I've got a random uniform column in here. So when I click OK, after I select my response, if I wanted to figure out which variables were important, then I might select all of those that are above that random uniform, or below would be unimportant. So that's traditionally how some folks have been trying to get some variable importance out of this predictor screening with respect to a cutoff on what's important and what's not important. So that's why you can also just add that in the add-in if you want. And then shadow column. Yeah, Daniel, just really quick. The shadow column is just, think of it as randomly reshuffled values for a predictor column. So if we have x1 and it has its relationship to y, if we shuffle all the values of x1 and then keep the y column the same, we've broken all the correlation between x1 and y, and we haven't changed any of the summary statistics of that column. It will have all the same min, max, median, values. And so that way we can measure now the predictor strength of x1 relative to just that random column of values. And that's useful for doing those t-tests, which maybe we need to consider, like Arvid was saying, maybe we do an FDR t-test, or the p-value from the FDR. And then when you say shuffling X and Y, you're not breaking the pairs. So when we shuffle these values, I don't think I have, when we shuffle the values, so for instance, in this column, the Y values are all here. And then, if we look at the X, it's easier to think of when you're looking at continuous variables. So what we do when we create that shadow column is we just randomly reshuffle all of these. So 0.2, might become 0.3 and 0.267 might become 0.3. So we pull all those into a matrix, shuffle the matrix, and then load them back into the column. So you're just breaking. So you still have the pair of caliper to Y, but then you also have shadow caliper to Y. And then you're trying to see the differences in their predictive abilities. Well, hopefully you give it a try. I know this is, I think as we were building this out, you know, we kept being concerned that we're over analyzing or over engineering, but I think it is helpful now to say where you've got a statistical basis for including or excluding certain predictors if you're building a model. You know, typically you don't want to intentionally put in factors that could just be noise. You're going to overfit your model, or you're going to get to large prediction variances, or it's not going to, that model might not work very well for new values. So the feature selection side of model building is really important. And this is just another tool that you can use to help make sure you're putting the right features into that model.
And Scott, Bill had a final question. Is there a way to see the shadow column data to see how things are shuffled?
No, we thought about keeping that, but data tables were getting really big. So right now, I think the only way to see it is if I stop the analysis. But no, the data tables, if I just run this again, and I go to the home window, you can just see that we're, I don't know if you can see, but it's generating the different tables and the different analysis in the background, but then we just flush all of that that data at the end just to just because it didn't seem worth keeping all of those shuffled columns. But yeah, maybe for a traceability standpoint, we could keep those. It wouldn't be too hard.